Welcome to the Note Investor Podcast. We'll guide you through the ups and downs of note investing and teach you all about the nitty-gritty details of the business that other people won't talk about. Your host, Dan Deppen, is a former aerospace engineer and product manager who transitioned away from cubicle life to full-time note investing in 2018. Our website is www.fusionnotes.com, where you can subscribe to this podcast, comment, and find links to other information on note investing.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Note Investor Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Deppen. And this week, episode 35, I'm going to be bringing you some new case studies. So I did a case study last time on seller finance. These two are going to be a little bit more, well, one of the deals is kind of more of a run-of-the-mill deal that ends up reperforming. And then I've got another one in here that gets pretty sideways. So I'm going to get into a few of the things that, a lot of people kind of don't like to talk about. And, some people are sort of surprised by if they're new to note. So I think you'll find this kind of hopefully informative. So it'll kind of give you a better idea what the range of possibilities are when you do non-performing notes. So this first one was a contract for deed that was in Port Huron, Michigan. And so Port Huron is kind of, northern Michigan, kind of close to Canada, northwest or northeast of Detroit. So I picked this note up for $27,500. It had an unpaid balance of $45,000 and a payoff of $51,000. So this was, a little more than 50% of UPB and had a pretty decent P&I of $489. One of the things I like about the higher P&I is your servicing cost, the percentage that you're paying every month for servicing costs goes down the higher that P&I is. For the BPO, the 30-day quick sale price came in at just under $70,000, and then the 90 to 120-day list price came in around $80,000. So there's some pretty decent equity in here and, kind of room to recover if I wasn't able to get it reperforming. Borrower was 24 months behind, so they were pretty far behind. But one of the things that I liked about this loan was the borrower was already on a forbearance agreement with the seller, and they had made 3 payments in the last 3 months. So even though they were a decent bit behind, it looked like there was some equity in the property, and the borrower was more than showing signs of life, having made 3 payments in a row. And the rental rates in the area, were decent as well. So this was one that I kind of liked. It's sort of my standard template of a non-performing note that's going to have a decent chance to reperform. So for the exit strategies that I looked at on this one, basically the baseline plan was just to continue with the forbearance agreement that the note seller already had in place. Now, what was a little weird, and I've seen this in other forbearance agreements that people create. I don't like it myself, but all it did was say, okay, for this specified period of time, as long as you make payments, we're not going to foreclose on you. But then it doesn't say what happens after that. Usually when I put together a forbearance agreement, I like to have it have a structure that says, okay, borrower, if you complete this forbearance agreement or trial payment plan, now at the end I'm going to modify the loan or do something for you so that it leads to a resolution. I don't like the idea of just kind of leaving it open-ended. So my plan was, once the borrower, they had a couple months left on this forbearance agreement. If they made good on that, then I would just restructure it to say, okay, make a couple more months of payments and then I'll modify the loan. And then at which point I can resell the performing loan. And when I bought this, it was at Madison Management, which I left there. Madison's one of my 2 servicers that I use. I also use Allied for a lot of stuff as well. But this one was already at Madison, so I just left it there. And they were the ones who had actually implemented the previous forbearance agreement on behalf of the previous seller. So I was fairly confident this would work. And then my backup plan, if getting it reperforming didn't work, as I would just follow through on the foreclosure and resell the property using Franco Barilli. And the one thing to kind of note is they do have a redemption period in Michigan, which I'm aware of. And then sort of the other plan too is if it did look like it was going to head for foreclosure, I was going to offer a cash for keys deal or deed in lieu, just because. Although I didn't have that really in the baseline plan because the borrower had been in the home since 2002. So I didn't think there was a big chance they were going to leave. And because they had been there so long, that was another reason I figured they would have a decent chance to reperform. The rub on that, though, is if they have been there that long and they just completely default and ride the ship down in a foreclosure, you're probably going to have a pretty ugly clean out right? Because those people like that are probably pack rats, and you're probably looking at renting a couple of dumpsters to get everything out. So that's kind of the trade-off on this one. So the ROI estimates that I had going in, which I always like to revisit. So at the time that I bought the note, and I always document this stuff so I, can kind of calibrate my model over time. So I figured if I was able to, keep it reperforming and modify it, I'd sell it at 80% of the unpaid balance, which would result in about a 37% ROI or 19% to the JV partner. There's some rounding. And then if it did end up going through foreclosure, I'd end up spending about $8,500 in total, and then end up with the sale proceeds of about $42,900. The sale proceeds are coming from the fact that it would be, because the CFD was actually over 5 years old, I would have to go through the foreclosure in Ohio. And so my proceeds would be limited to my payoff. And I would need to double check this, but I believe I could be wrong about this, but I believe there's some pretty severe caps on the attorney fees that you can recoup in Michigan. So I basically just assumed if it went to foreclosure, I would get the payoff on the loan, but not necessarily reimbursement for expenses. Maybe I could have gotten some, that would be a bonus. That's one of the ways I try to keep these a little conservative. And that ended up working out to about a 19% ROI or 10% to the JV partner. So decent. And this is like, again, kind of one of my bread and butter type notes where it's got a high probability of reperforming. And, typically with those, you're paying a little more for them. So you still do really well in the return if it reperforms. But kind of the rub is if you do have to go and foreclose, then the deal becomes thinner at that point. So I bought the loan, got it transferred, started the loss mitigation. So I used Polaris counselors for the initial outreach like I used to always do. And I may have mentioned last time, Polaris counselors actually exited the business, so I don't use them anymore, but that's what I was using at the time. And through the course of this, I ended up, having several phone calls with the borrower. He was a really good guy. He was pretty good to work with. He got angry at the servicer one or two times. He had a little bit of a temper, but overall was a good guy. And when I talked to him, he was one of these borrowers who really wanted to get the loan back on track. And he was also concerned about his credit. He had mentioned that this was his only loan and they had taken care of credit cards and other debt, and this was the only loan that they had, and they were really focused on getting this straightened out and taken care of. He was frustrated with some of the previous lenders who owned the loan, and that's one of the advantages you can have in this industry as an individual note investor. A lot of these notes that are in larger portfolios, they often just get neglected, or they don't have the ability to give individual attention to a loan. And I actually don't recall who I bought this one from, but some of the people that I buy a contract for deeds from are having, portfolios of several thousand loans, so that's not possible. So for him to be able to get on the phone with somebody and get things worked out, he really appreciated. In fact, he asked me never to sell his loan. He said, can you just hold on to this loan? And, obviously it's not really what I do. It is going to get sold at some point, so I had to disappoint him there. But overall, we had, good conversations, pretty satisfying. So what ended up happening was, we got through the end of the forbearance period, and then I just ended up modifying the loan, basically stretching out the term and resetting it to being current, and then held on to it for about 6 more months. So did some extra seasoning after the modification, and then sold the loan. Overall ended up holding it for about 9 months. I think I was initially assuming I would hold it maybe 12 total in that scenario. So the total cost basis, if you look at, so there's the price of the note that was $27,500. There was about $400 in principal that was paid back, so that cost basis got knocked down by about $400. And then total holding costs were $1,629. So that was $500 to Madison for the loan mod fee. There was a couple $100 for Polaris for borrower outreach, monthly servicing fees, due diligence, pulling a BPO, O&E report, title review, some other things in there. And then when I sold the note, you've always got some selling costs. There's usually some recording fees, and if you sell it through PaperStack, which I often do, there's some fees there. So I ended up netting $33,905 from that. So the total profit on the sale was just over $5,000. So it was about $5,174. And that was from the sale of the note. But then, we'd also been collecting payments for several months. So if you look at the interest portion of those payments, that was $1,962. So ended up with a total profit a little over $7,000, and it ended up being a 24% ROI, which I was very happy with. Now from the JV perspective, they funded $29,700, which was a little more than what I actually ended up spending. It was about $1,000 more than what I ended up spending. And so their share of the splits from the profit on sale plus the split of interest was 35.69, so they ended up with a 12% return. And that was over a 9-month timeline, so the annualized return ended up being 15.1%. And this is kind of a normal, solid, reperforming note return. This is actually a little bit on the low end of what the returns end up being when you get a note reperforming. But, I would call this kind of like a solid base hit kind of a deal. So with these, I always review the lessons learned. So if you look at what I had estimated up front, I had said if this reperforms, I was anticipating an ROI of 37%, and my actual was 24%. And there were a couple of reasons for that. The main one was I sold it for about 75% of the unpaid balance instead of the 80% that I had assumed. That was the big one. The other thing was, in my assumptions, I assumed a holding period of about 12 months. So I said I was collecting 12 months of payments. I only collected 9. So that's about, $1,500 total. So that was a pretty big chunk. The expenses were actually a little bit lower. I was estimating the expenses about $2,200, and they actually came in a little over $1,600. So I was conservative there. Things I could have potentially done differently was held it and seasoned it longer. If I held this for 12 months instead of 9 months, or even longer than that, I would have collected more payments, and maybe I could have gotten closer to that 80% of UPB. But, 80% of UPB is these days kind of tough to get a lot of times on CFDs. And then you got to remember too, you can increase the ROI just by holding it longer. In this case, because it's reperforming and payments are coming in, right? But then it can also affect your annualized return. So if holding it longer doesn't get you enough of a bump in the sale price, of the loan, then it may or may not be beneficial. One of the things I haven't really done yet that I've thought about a little bit is, trying to figure out how to optimize the holding time. And really with a lot of these joint ventures, what I do now is it kind of comes down to what the partner wants to do. When we get to the point where it's performing and we could sell it for a decent profit, I ask them what they want to do. And sometimes they're looking to exit, like the case here. Other times they're like, no, I'm content to just kind of hold it. So, that all depends. But maybe holding times are one of those things I'll be able to optimize a little bit at some point in the future. So that's our first deal. Pretty base hit, which I got a lot of these in the queue too, actually, that I'm getting ready to sell. Now, the second one, this is probably the more informative one. So the first one's the way you want things to go, and that's actually the way they go most of the time. But sometimes you get ones like this second one. So there's another contract for deed. This is in Ashtabula, Ohio, which is up by Lake Erie. So it's a non-performer. Picked the note up for $17,000. The unpaid balance was a little over $35,000, so about 50% of UPB, a little less than that. And the total payoff was $41,400. P&I was a little on the lower side, about $308, but it's fine. There were about $1,900 in delinquent taxes I had to take care of. And the loan was 20 months delinquent, and they had only made one payment in the last 12 months. So it kind of met my threshold of having some payments in the last 12 months, but there was just one. So obviously it kind of just barely met that. Now, what I really liked about this though was the BPO value. So the BPO value came in for a 30-day quick sale of $103,500 and then had a 90 to 120-day list of $114,500. So, this is a note I'm buying for $17,000 and there's a BPO value of $100,000. So even though it's pretty delinquent, hasn't really had payments, this is one that's likely heading to a foreclosure. There's so much equity in there. I'm really happy with this. So with this, it's like if it reperforms, it's a home run. If you have to foreclose, you're still doing great. If the borrower does a deed in lieu, even better. So I went into this one, basically wearing a big happy hat. I was really excited about this one. And I'm kind of foreshadowing that this is going to change at some point, but we'll get to it. So the ROI estimates going in. So I was assuming if we got it reperforming, sell it at 70% of unpaid balance. Ashtabula is a little smaller town, not rural by any stretch. And that would be a 61% ROI or 30% to the JV partner. And then if we had to go through a foreclosure, this is in Ohio, it's a judicial state. There were $2,000 in delinquent taxes and I looked at holding costs and everything. I was assuming kind of a worst case of about $12,000 for that. And then my sale proceeds, I was assuming would be $42,000. So even though the BPO value is like $100, so let's say it sold at a sheriff's auction for $80, I'm going to be limited to my payoff amount. And so I would, being very conservative in the assumption and just assuming my payoff was limited to my unpaid balance. Now in reality, you would probably be able to recoup more of the arrearages that are part of that payoff balance. And then, legal costs that I had accrued and other things, but I like to just kind of assume the worst. And that would still be a 45% ROI or a 22% return to the JV partner. So this one, like I said, I was not necessarily my bread and butter in that there was only one payment in the last 12 months, so it was more likely to foreclose. I like ones that are more likely to reperform, but because of all the equity and the way the ROIs worked out, I really, really liked it. So my strategy was to have Polaris reach out to the borrower and see if we could get them on some kind of a trial payment plan and forbearance where they would make some kind of good faith down payment, make the next 6 to 12 payments on time, at which point I would modify the loan and roll the remaining arrearages into the loan balance. The other thing I was willing to do was to try to cancel the existing land contract, get a new one. Because this one, although it was a contract for deed, because it had over 5 years of payments, I was likely going to have to foreclose in Ohio. So if I could work something out where we canceled the existing land contract and created a new one, that would be good too, because then that would reset that 5-year clock. And then, if I did have to follow through and take the property back, it would just be a forfeiture instead of that. But I was totally comfortable going through with the foreclosure because of all the equity. So I offered them a $2,000 cash for keys, and then I also offered them a forbearance trial payment plan where they would make a $2,000 good faith down payment and then 12 payments of $600 in a row. And then at that point, I would modify the loan. And then, to my surprise, they did accept the $2,000 cash for keys, which I was super excited about. Now, when they started working on getting out of there, they piled up a lot of trash outside by the road, like more than what the city could take. The trash started blowing around the street. The city gave me a code violation. The city was a real pain to work with. I mean, some of the people I talked to would be kind of nice, but overall, not the most friendly city. You run into these situations sometimes with code enforcement where they can kind of view you as their piggy bank. Sometimes they're very good to work with, other times they're not. These people were a giant pain, so there were some other costs associated with that. I ended up just getting a dumpster for the borrower so he could get his stuff in there and get the heck out. To me, that was cheaper than paying for a clean out, and it was cheaper than racking up fines. So I did end up with some extra costs on top of that as well. So we finally got him out, had an REO. Now remember, if you're looking at this on YouTube, I had showed a picture of the house at the beginning, right? So when I pulled the BPO, got pictures of the property, the outside actually looked pretty good. Yard was cut, outside looked okay. Bushes were kind of trimmed. And, based on the comps and everything, it seemed to support that $100,000 value. But when we got inside there, the inside was just trashed. I mean, it was completely destroyed. And then there was only one bathroom in the property. It was supposed to have 2 bathrooms. So that didn't help the value, although, basically everything had to be gutted and needed a rehab. The thing that made me very sad about the whole thing was the borrower did have kids. So you had kids living in the situation that was just really repugnant and ugly. And, in my discussions with the code enforcement people, they knew this guy. He was like one of their problem residents. A lot of cities have these, and they were aware that just the whole situation was really, really sad. It's sad to see anybody living like that, but especially somebody with relatively small kids. So it was not a good situation. I did use, I won't say who it is, but a national REO agency to kind of do the property management, to get the property secured, to get the BPO pulled and get photos, and then manage the sale. And so when I got my interior BPO afterwards, it came back with a 30-day quick sale value of $15,000 and a 60 to 90-day list value of $20,000. So my $100,000 BPO property that looked good on the outside turned into a $15,000 to $20,000 property when I got it back. So, fortunately, this is the only one I've had this happen on, but it's the kind of thing that can happen. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure how to eliminate the risk unless you actually send somebody from Craigslist to peek in the windows, which is illegal, and don't recommend doing that. They did give some estimate of the repairs needed in rehab, and they came up with an estimate of $57,200 in rehab needed to get the house back in shape to support that, 114 to 120 day list I had initially. So that was pretty rough. I was really not interested in taking on the rehab if I had done that. So here's the thing, in theory, could have potentially rehabbed out of this, but when you do that, it would basically be putting in twice as much money as was put into the deal in the first place. So you're basically in for 3x what you originally planned. And Ashtabula is not the biggest town in the world. I forget how large it is, maybe 15,000 people, 20,000. And I didn't have a network on the ground. If I had somebody I knew who was a rehabber in the area and that I trusted, then that becomes a more viable option. But I think just as an out-of-towner, just taking on a bunch of rehab like that is really rolling the dice, because you don't know what kind of job they're going to do. You don't know what they're going to find later. You don't know that they're going to deal with you honestly. There are all kinds of things that could go wrong in that kind of scenario. So on the sale, I ended up getting a couple offers at $15,000, which I rejected. I'm like, well, I'm just going to hold on and see what I can get. And then I finally got an offer for $20,000, which I just went ahead and accepted and basically took the L. That netted a little over $16,000 in proceeds because I had, the brokerage fee and the fees to the REO agency. So that was kind of a pretty huge bust. So let's look at the numbers. And this whole thing made me this deal ended several months ago, but made me kind of sick going back through all this. The cost base, so the note was $17,000, ended up with $7,340 in holding costs. $2,000 of that was delinquent taxes. There were other property taxes due while I held it. There was the cost of the dumpster. There was the cash for keys money. There was the code violation fine, servicing costs. There were some legal fees to write up the surrender of possession and deed in lieu agreement. So my total cost basis was $24,340, and then I netted $16,157 back. So there was a loss of a little over $8,100 or a minus 33.6% ROI. From the JV perspective, they had funded $29,000, which we didn't spend all of it. So with that $8,183 loss, their return was minus 28%. The only remotely decent thing about this was, it did go relatively fast. It was, 4 months. So at least, the proceeds, they got that back, relatively soon. They didn't have to wait a year for foreclosure and then do that. That's where this thing could have been worse, right? I mean, if the guy wouldn't have done the cash for keys and I had to foreclose, those foreclosure expenses would have been $5,000 to $6,000 instead of the $2,000 cash for keys. And my holding costs would have run longer. So this actually could have been a lot worse. The other thing could have potentially done was required an inspection before the cash for keys. But the thing is, even if you go in there and you find out it's trashed and you say, well, I'm not giving you the $2,000 for the cash for keys. He says, okay, I'm sitting tight. Now I'm still foreclosing, right? So unless you can, convince him just to leave for free at that point. But it's kind of a tough situation overall. So it's a pretty big loss in this one. This is the worst one that I've had so far. At least it was not a wipeout, which is good. I've talked to a lot of experienced note investors who have had ones get a lot worse than this. The other thing that was interesting too, for the joint venture partner, so they lost 28% on this one. But we had done a deal previous to this where we completed a forfeiture. The borrower sacrificed a lot of equity, and their return after the split was 68%. So they went plus 68% on one and minus 28% on the next. So that's more volatile than most, but that gives you an indication of how volatile non-performers can be. And I think a lot of people don't quite realize how volatile they are. Now, net going plus 68%, minus 28%, they're still doing good. We've actually got another one running that's reperforming and has been doing very well. But don't think they were happy. They were pissed. I mean, ultra pissed about this. So that's just one of the challenges of the business overall. So the lessons learned, got a bunch of them here. Number one is that BPOs can just have limited value, right? I mean, even in this case where the outside looked good, and I've gone back and revisited those pictures lots of times going, where was the clue that this thing was messed up? And it's just not there. So it's always one of the risks that you have, no matter what it looks like on the outside. You may encounter problems on the inside of the property. And the other one is, and that's why these days a lot of times, I often just don't pull BPOs. Nowadays, I get photos and I'll get a property inspection, and then I'll look at comps and I'll basically do my own value. Because I've also done experiments with pulling multiple BPOs, and then I end up getting values that are just all over the place. So they're a challenge. The second lesson learned was that if you have a borrower that accepts cash for keys, that could be that something's wrong with the property. I've had at least 3, I think, where the borrower was willing to do a cash for keys, and there were major problems wrong on the inside of the house. So a lot of times if a borrower is ready just to bail, especially if it looks like there's a lot of equity, then that could indicate that something's wrong. Because for the most part, you shouldn't expect borrowers to just forfeit equity. Now, I did have one case where they did it in a major way, like the one that was the plus 68% return after the split that I mentioned. But most of the time, if the borrower is willing to just walk away, it means the value in the property isn't there. The other lesson learned, I mentioned how the joint investor was really upset is that, everybody likes to gamble until something goes wrong. And I've seen this, multiple times, whether it was, a deal like this, which is kind of an extreme case, or just even some cases where, something happens in a deal and I deliver some bad news to the partner. And a lot of times, even then, like something looks like it's going to be a problem and it turns out to be nothing. But when I talk to investors up front, when we're getting ready to do things, even sometimes if they've had a lot of real estate experience or their investing experience, everybody is always down to gamble. And they're like, oh yeah, I know these are volatile, but that's okay. I can handle it. And then sometimes when something does go wrong, they flip the other way. And they're like, I don't like this anymore. So it's just part of that human psychology. So if you are getting into, especially the non-performing side, we're taking on more risk, just really try to think through that, because, there are a lot of inherent risks in these things. And, some of these, like this one, I still haven't quite figured out how to mitigate all of them. But on the bright side, the other thing I really take away from this is just how resilient note investments can be. I mean, if you look at it from the perspective of, it turned out that the property was only worth 20% of the BPO value. So the BPO was 80% off, right? I mean, in another kind of real estate deal, if your property turns out only to be worth 20% of what you thought it was, how is that going to turn out, right? In this case, it was a 33% loss, which is still significant. But, in relative terms, it could have been a lot worse. And then the last thing is that, rehabbing your way out can be an option, but I think you're really rolling the dice if you go there. I did look up the property as I was putting this together, and the person who bought it did end up rehabbing it and then sold it about 3 months later for significantly more money. Now, I would love to know what their cost basis is. And they didn't have pictures of what the inside looked like afterwards, but they did say that they, completely rehabbed everything, completely redid the kitchens and bathrooms and the roof and other stuff. So based on that, there was a possibility, if you could rehab that thing for $50,000, could have still done okay. But, if you do that, you're throwing not only good money after bad, you're throwing like twice again as much money in as you put into it in the first place. And whoever did that fix and flip, probably had their own crew or did it themselves or whatever. Taking on $50,000 in rehab in a smallish area as an out-of-stater, I think is just way too dicey. I would only do that if I had somebody on the ground that I trusted. Although theoretically, that could have happened, could have rolled the dice, could have gone in for a lot more and potentially turned it into a winner. But I don't think that would have been a justified risk. So those are my 2 case studies for today. But I think the other takeaway is that I think some of this demonstrates the benefits of a fund model. So one of the things I've been showing is, and with this and some of the data I was sharing in the last podcast, the returns are overall good. So I've been averaging over, I think, 11.5% to JV investors after the split. And that's actually going to be higher than that because I have a bunch of exits coming up. But the problem is, when one of them goes red like this, people get really upset, even if net they're doing great based on the other deals that have been home runs. But the fund models are nice because when you're not tied to a single note, you're involved in a pool, your returns get smoothed out. So if one of them goes red like this one, it's really not going to affect you too much. It's not going to create a crisis. Whereas when you're doing these joint ventures, every problem is a crisis, and they're so volatile that you end up dealing with a lot of crises. So that's one of the reasons why I like the fund model. Now I'm continuing to do joint ventures. I'm doing more of the performing / subperforming in the fund, and then continuing to do non-performers as joint ventures. But long term, I think the fund model is a little easier to run and lower stress for me and for the joint venture partners as well. And some people have an aversion to funds because they tend to pay a fixed flat preferred return. I think one of the things that attracts people to joint ventures and non-performing is they like the idea of novelty returns, right? They like the idea of being able to get, like 68% on a deal like that other person did. And so that goes away with the fund, but it's also taken out the risk, and it's also taken out significantly minimizing the risk of the heartache of like a 33% reduction. So those are my thoughts for today. If you have any questions for me, always feel free to reach out. You can always send me an email at dan@fusionnotes.com. And if you got any questions on this or other things or suggestions for topics or people to talk to in future episodes, I'd love to hear those as well. So that's it for now. See you guys next time.